and good evening to everybody who's joined us online. We're all online tonight, and it's the last one for the year. We'll be back in person, fingers crossed, in 2022. This is, I think this is our fourth or maybe our fifth, I've lost track, in the series Afghanistan 20 Years On. And it's been 3.5 months, as we all know, since the Taliban took control of Afghanistan. Hunger and poverty have worsened, and the number of people facing a very lean winter has grown to an enormous proportion of the population. And the Taliban promised the war is over, but the violence continues as the Taliban has been, they're fighting between themselves, and they're also now dealing with the ISKP. There's been a lot of revisionism. Before the collapse of the Republic, Afghanistan had long been one of the poorest and most corrupt countries in the world. The UN agencies annually warned that children and the wider population faced starvation during the winter. People were leaving the country in large numbers for many years, and the situation for women and Shia was also very precarious, far from perfect, though at the very least they did have the protection of the constitution. So outside Afghanistan, efforts to resettle vulnerable people appear to have ground to a near halt. Private citizens appear to be doing the work that the NATO member governments should be doing in helping vulnerable people leave the country. I don't think they're doing what they even should be doing. The Taliban control of media means we know less and less about what's really going on inside the country. Western journalists who visit keep telling us that it's normal, that it's safe, although it does seem to be far from that for ordinary Afghan people. So where do we go from here? At the front line this evening, we've got a stellar lineup, as usual, of people who can shed some light on the old, new Afghanistan under the Taliban. And I'll introduce each guest. They'll talk on their special subject for 5 minutes or so. And then at the end, we'll have some audience participation and some questions. So let's get going. Our first guest is Shahzad Akbar, who's the chairperson of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. She worked for the National Security Council of the previous government and as an advisor to the former president on peace, development and civilian protection. She has a PhD from Oxford University and was a country director in Afghanistan for Open Society. She joins us from Istanbul. Thank you so much for your time, Shahzad. Can you give us an overview of the situation on the ground in Afghanistan right now and in the last 3.5 months, how it's unfolded, and what actions you believe the West should be taking to safeguard the population generally, vulnerable people in particular, and including ensuring that aid reaches the people who need it?
Thank you, Lane. Thank you for that kind introduction, although I do not have a PhD from Oxford, just an MA. I'm so honored to be part of this discussion and to be part of this panel of experts and friends, and I look forward to hearing from everyone. The situation, as you described, has been very difficult in the past 3 months, but of course, again, as you said, some of the difficulties that we are seeing today and we have seen in the past 3 months, they have existed for a long time. It has just been exacerbated. In the past 20 years, looking back, I think the 3 big L's for me in Afghanistan were corruption, culture of impunity, and the conflict. And corruption, culture of impunity both fit the conflict. The brutal, devastating conflict that destroyed Afghanistan and took so many lives away. And looking in my field in human rights, one of the big missing elements was, of course, access to justice, or meaningful access to justice for victims of war and for population more broadly. Now, now since Taliban's takeover, when we look at the situation for access to justice, we really don't have a functioning justice system. While they have appointed people in the Attorney General's office and in the courts, the people who have been appointed don't necessarily have professional credentials. But also the common understanding of Taliban authorities, de facto authorities, is that every authority is the judge, the prosecutor, and the soldier, police, all rolled into one. So we do see a lot of instances of arbitrary detentions, unfortunately reports of torture and detention, as well as extrajudicial killings. and all forms of quote-unquote punishments that are illegal under, well, the existing Afghan law. Which brings me to the second point. We really don't know what this the de facto government is operating and what the legal framework the de facto government is upholding. It's not clear if the current Afghan constitution is being upheld in all the Afghan laws, including, for instance, anti-torture law or elimination of violence against women law. Obviously, these laws are not being upheld in action, but they have not been repealed or replaced with new laws. So there is a state of legal limbo in which the citizens live. And one of the groups that has been most affected is, of course, women by the universal restriction on their rights across Afghanistan. While some restrictions are very context specific, for instance, restrictions on movement may be a bit more lax in some places than others. Every Afghan woman across Afghanistan has less rights than they had 4 months ago, legal rights, and less ability to exercise those rights. Access to education, of course, as we all know, has been limited for girls in many parts of Afghanistan to secondary education. Universities, women's employment, women in public sector have been told to stay home, except in health and education. And other aspects of public sector, other ministries, women professionals have been told to stay home and wait for a very uncertain future. It is literally a gender apartheid, what we're seeing in Afghanistan. And female victims of domestic abuse have nowhere to go. The only option that they have is to live with their abusers, because the commission cannot be operational anymore because our colleagues live in Fair, and shelters and other, other structures of support, including, for instance, the elimination of violence against women units in the Attorney General's office and the courts, none of these are functional. So that's the situation for female victims of domestic abuse. And the future looks very uncertain for all Afghans, men and women, because of the dire humanitarian crisis. People are struggling to stay alive. And even if the humanitarian pledge is met, there is a serious economic crisis that's crippling the country, and that's hurting citizens every day. And this is due to, lack of cash, literally lack of cash in the Afghan economy, and sanctions and all the restrictions that have been imposed. So coming to what needs to happen, I think when we look at the human rights situation and the humanitarian situation, there is a double crisis. The human rights situation was difficult before as well, but now it's completely devastating. And the humanitarian situation is also extremely urgent. And there needs to be intervention to resolve both, but to resolve the humanitarian situation, I think going beyond just humanitarian aid, creatively, the international community needs to be thinking about some situation of humanitarian plus. What more can be done? And there are some solutions out there, short of calling off all sanctions or channeling money directly to Taliban. There are other ways of relieving the pressure, which I hope and I request that people are working on 24/7. Of course, we should not take agency away from Taliban. Taliban have agency. Taliban are the de facto rulers. It's their primary responsibility to care for the Afghan population. And so far, they have not taken a single step to show that they care about starving Afghans. They haven't taken a single step to show that they're willing to take steps to create trust with the international community and with the Afghan people, to be more inclusive, to respect women's legal and Islamic rights. So the situation is, of course, also, they have agency and they're responsible for the situation that we are seeing right now on the ground. There's a lot of fluidity and uncertainty. I can't tell you with certainty what will be seen in Afghanistan 3 months or 6 months from now, except that if we don't intervene now, we didn't predict how horrific it would get. But unfortunately, if there are not effective interventions, we will only see worse in terms of human suffering. Let's stop there.
Yes, thank you. It's you're saying it's only going to get worse. Days I wonder how much worse it can get, but thank you, Shahzad. Very grateful to you. I'm going to move now to Omar Sado. Thanks for joining us, Omar. Omar is a research scholar at the University of Pittsburgh and an assistant professor of political science at the American University of Afghanistan. And like many Afghans now living in exile, Omar, you've had a lot of time to think about what happened and why, who has responsibility for the collapse of the Republic and why are those who are responsible not taking responsibility. There's a lot of butt casting going on, and which we'll also get to with subsequent speakers, but inextricable from the blame game, of course, is the way the Taliban were sold by an international community that wanted to get out of Afghanistan. We were told it's Taliban 2.0, they're reasonable people now, changed jihadis, people we can do business with. Omar, you've put a lot of thought into this, haven't you?
Thank you, Lenny. Good afternoon to everyone. Good morning, good evening to others who are staying from other places and watching us. I'm grateful for this opportunity. I think you flag quite very fundamental points, I think. The personal responsibility, collective responsibility that I was trying to spend some time in the last 3 months to reflect on myself. But I think since the fall of Kabul, we have seen continuous emerging discussion revolving around some of the key issues which are touching people's daily life. We have been trying to understand the cause of the failure of Kabul, and propose some way out for this current kind of catastrophe that we observe. And in most of the cases, we do not have an easy made solution or pre-prepared solution for them. Now, since the fall of Kabul on 15th of August, the fall and the catastrophe followed by that has been characterized in different terms. And one of the buzzwords and terms for that was this humanitarian catastrophe to characterize the current state of affairs. This means to some extent that at least there is, from a humanitarian perspective, there has been certain form of acknowledgement and recognition for what has been going on in Afghanistan. Others, for example, just now I heard Shahzad, and earlier also I've heard her that she was also continuously trying to characterize this as a gender genocide, and which is quite right in another dimension. Some others also tried to characterize this as a politicide in the sense that this is a deliberate physical extermination of a group of people whose members do not share necessarily an hetero-rational background, but they share common kind of political ideas. And the attempt is by the incumbent political elite or government to eradicate them, this group which has some certain form of maybe in the shape of political movement or beyond that one. Anyway, but I think all of these characterizations to somehow they are correct, but they also miss to capture one key dimensions of this calamity, and that is the longevity of calamity in Afghanistan. By longevity, I mean that Afghanistan is continuously falling in this vicious trap cycle of war, conflict, catastrophe, calamity, displacement, migration, killing, atrocities, right? This is not unique of my time. My previous generation, my father and my mother, they also experienced the same thing. And also that if you go back to the history, last 100 years of the modern Afghanistan since its foundation, I think it was the foundation of the state was parallel with genocide, democide, politicide, and so many other kind of atrocities. And unfortunately, this points out to one of the fundamental failures of all of us, including the political elite and the rest in Afghanistan, to find out a solution or as a political order in order to stabilize and create certain form of state and civilized form of peace. Now, having said this, I would like to point out that I understand that certain form of in this kind of uncertain times where people are suffering, it is easy to point fingers on others. This brings me to the issue of personal responsibility, and I was reading on her end, she has a good article on personal responsibility under totalitarian orders, and wherein she reflects on her experience 20 years back during this Second World War, how Germans tried to understand, unpack, and overcome the atrocities of the Nazis in Germany. And of course, there was a kind of public common sense of guilt amongst, I mean, Germans, probably European civilization, and rest humanity. She reflects that, well, why we failed to prevent such kind of atrocities. And probably we also may think the same way. I was never part of the government, and probably I am happy about it just now, but at certain levels, there is a sense of guilt with us, as being, for example, outspoken, probably who have been appeared in media or taught in university in different capacities. Probably sometimes we think about what was our role in this catastrophe, in this calamity, right? But now this doesn't mean that we undermine the importance of personal responsibility. And unfortunately, in this, I see failure of morality in Afghanistan. And that's multidimensional. In the last 3 months, some people came and spoke about their experience. I mean, those who were in the government. And some people remain silent. So that at that level, for example, those who have been in the government and politically, the most important people, they have kept silent, including the fugitive prisoner Ashraf Ghani. And he has never come and apologized to people as the one who was #1 responsible for the previous government, and probably the many others who were close aid to him. So this is a moral responsibility for them to come and say what were their rules, right? And instead of blaming others. Second, I see people who were in the top level of government, but they came and instead of acknowledging their own part, they tried to point finger on the rest. And to a certain extent, they said, oh, well, if we had not been part of the previous government, probably we could have, I mean, we were there, they were just fine like this there. If we were there in order to mitigate the risks. This is something which I found in Hannah Arendt also, that she says some of the people who were part of Nazi atrocities, when they were in trial, they said, oh, we went there to mitigate the risk. But what they failed to do is to take responsibility for them. And then finally, I also observed people who worked during last 1 year, like let's say 2021, 20, they were trying to, for any kind of opportunity to get a position in the government, as a minister, as a deputy minister, and XYZ, but now they just write in social media, well, we were not part of it, but these XYZ people were part of it because they were just in the government. But they ignore the fact that we know that they are also trying themselves any kind of opportunistic opportunity to get in the system and plunder the resources as the rest that. And finally, the last thing that I see is many also blame external actors, our neighbors, great powers, and XYZ for what is going on, right? That's also understandable in certain level. I appreciate some of those, of course. For example, I have here Ambassador Alexander, which I mean, it's great from him that he is supporting the cause of people of Afghanistan. But blaming everything on Pakistan is something which is coming from very exclusionary ethno-nationalism of Afghans. And yeah, Afghanistan exists before Pakistan, and this catastrophe is not just catastrophe of our time. And as I said at the beginning, it has been the crisis. Afghanistan has been in the crisis for 120 years, the time that Pakistan didn't exist, right? So one element is, of course, that, but to just flag one issue and try to escape the personal responsibility, that's, I think, will not do justice to the people of Afghanistan. Of course, it was a kind of moral dilemma, the other dimension and the last dimension of failure of morality that I will try to flag and then quit, is that, I mean, before fall of Kabul, I was part of certain informal debates with friends and people who had chance to leave Afghanistan before 15th of August. And of course, one of the key issues that we were discussing was, is it morally right to stay in the country or to leave? Because the issue of dual citizenship and those who came just for any kind of easy opportunity to take part in the state and plunder resources, but easily they had also a second chance to, whenever there was a catastrophe, they left the country, they left the people without any kind of and just despair. What was our rule in that? could we play a kind of constructive role to what was our options to stay there? Probably could have, how we could have maybe engaged another way. And in that also I see there was not enough opportunity for everyone. You have to come from a certain ethno-cultural background to stay now even in Kabul. For me, it's of course risky because I don't have that certain ethno-cultural identity to give me a kind of cover against Taliban atrocities. But now those who stayed, I mean, this is a failure of morality, that now some who have, because of the privileged identity that they have, who have stayed, now they claim that, oh, why you people left? We could have done much more change, but they do not understand that this social hierarchy and the privilege of identity that they have at the top, that is not available for everyone, and hence some people were forced to leave the country. It is not it's a kind of easy choice, an option for many to stay in the country. I will stop here and probably will come back again. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Omar. A litany of failure indeed, which is the perfect segue into our next guest, Tamim Assay. Tamim is a former Deputy Minister of Defence for the Republic and the founder and Executive Director of the Institute of War and Peace Studies. Tamim joins us from Oxford in the UK. Thanks for being with us. On the collapse of the Republic and the blame game that we've been hearing from Omar, there's also been a lot of blame put on the Afghan military forces for the physical collapse of the country. I don't really think that that's fair. I visited a lot of hard-fighting men on front lines across the country, and I thought that the failures were very many and complex. And so I'd be grateful, Tamim, if you can talk to us about what happened from your point of view, and from there on to the current security situation, especially the Taliban's transition from insurgents to counterinsurgency vis-a-vis ISKP, and how that's working out. Come in.
Thank you very much, Len. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Especially good to see my old boss mentor, Chris Alexander, somebody who I have a lot of respect for. Worked it back in 2003 with him, for him. General Charlie, thank you so much for all your services. A very good friend, somebody I've known for many years. Shahzad, everyone here I know who are personal friends of mine and come with a lot of experience, and I've learned throughout my years from them. I wanted to talk about the failure of the the collapse of the Afghan security forces, as well as take stock of the current security situation, and then how would that translate and would have implications for the region. But before that, I want to pay tribute to the 60,000+ Afghan National Defense and Security Forces who fought bravely, gave the ultimate sacrifice, and fought for the ideals they believed with valor and bravery. And we acknowledge them, and we owe a great amount of debt to them. It's because of their sacrifices that many of us studied, worked, and used the opportunities that we had. A lot of those folks were poor rural boys who fought, and we need to acknowledge that. And whatever happened in Afghanistan was not a military failure, it was a political failure. And it's unfair to blame them for the catastrophe and the calamity that happened. Now, what happened, why the collapse of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces came? I would be very brief on that. Specifically, it was really 4 factors that played a big role and expedited the collapse of the Afghan Defense and Security Forces. It was, in fact, I think collapse is probably the wrong word to use. It was really disintegration. The first one, the crisis of legitimacy. The political leadership of Afghanistan lost its legitimacy in the eyes of the soldiers, the one who were fighting the fight day in and day out. Ashraf Ghani and his national security team was no longer a credible leadership who could inspire the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. And that is why the rank and file that I and many others were in touch outside of the government through our research and work and others often complained that why such and such person are giving us orders, or there were multiple chains of commands, or why there was too much micromanagement. And then there were complaints about food and, you know, their salary is not coming on time. And it eventually led to the issue of a lot of civilian appointees within the security sector who did not have the credibility to lead those institutions, besides this policy and support functions, which all civilians in security and military institutions are supposed to be doing under the NATO model. So, and plus the involvement of the Afghan National Defense Security leadership in the last election, the fraudulent election, when the military and police was used as instrument to instigate fraud within the election. That's when they lost all sorts of legitimacy. And I think it would make a very good PhD topic probably for anybody to look into that how does legitimacy and involvement of the security sector in a fraudulent election would impact their morale as well as their valor, not valor, but their motives to fight and give their lives. The second thing was dependency. There was too much interdependency of the Afghan defense and security forces, specifically on the back-end support, logistics, intelligence, on the US and NATO forces. When the US started the Doha process, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, there were caveats put on them, imposed on them. And they saw that the partners who were fighting shoulder on shoulder with them actually stopped fighting. And then they said, why should we fight when they make peace? It is, if it is going to be our fight, we have to be both in it. So the Doha process, the back-end logistical support dependencies played a crucial role there. That is why you saw that many of us warned about this 3D effect, the defection, desertion, and dwindling resources that unfortunately took a toll. The third element and the big elephant of the room is Pakistan and the safe havens in Pakistan and the role that Pakistan played in terms of waging hybrid war. I think the last episode that we saw in Afghanistan was the best example of proxy hybrid war that Pakistan put in play in Afghanistan. We should give them that credit, but at the same time, they should also take responsibility for the hybrid warfare that they went beyond that proxy model that they always pursued. And the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces leadership didn't even know what hybrid warfare is. Some of us warned about them that, well, they're targeting the minds and motives of your forces, and they want to break the backbone of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces because they thought that's the way, you know, to combine regular warfare with irregular warfare with disinformation, and then basically pursue that. Finally, the fourth thing, which is, I think, quite critical to all of the above in terms of the disintegration, was the design of the model of the army and the police and the way of warfare. When I was at MOD and at the National Security Council, I did tell President, at least on 2 occasions that I remember, that this model of an army sending a regular force after an irregular force is a recipe for disaster. You need to decentralize this war. You need to pursue, go for more of an irregular warfare. At the same time, this army is not a complete army. There are classes within this army which is totally non-existent, like intelligence, logistics, other things. Now, in terms of the current security situation, right now Afghanistan is in a free fall, and the security landscape, the threat landscape, if you look into it, it's a safe haven for terrorists under the umbrella of the Taliban. Almost all of the foreign fighters, the hardened foreign fighters, mid-level to high-ranking, I'm told, are moving from Central Asia, as well as some of them already moved from Middle East to Afghanistan. Taliban are providing that umbrella and safe haven to them. And then at the same time, if you look at the internal political security landscape of Afghanistan, while Taliban are nominally in control, but essentially it's a bunch of fiefdoms. It's an anarchy, political security anarchy, where every governor is in charge of his own kingdom, has his own kingdom. In Kabul alone, there's 15 groups of Taliban operating. And if you look at it from in terms of the control and chain of command, effectively, the Taliban have a hard time transforming from a decentralized insurgency to a centralized, professional armed forces. There is no army, there is no police, not even in Kabul. And the intelligence that they have is quite weak organizational-wise. They haven't yet spelled out what sort of security forces they want. They call it Islamic Army, but it doesn't really mean much. They have not spelled out how they want to support and build that particular Islamic Army that they have in mind. Now, we saw episodes. We already see that Taliban are negotiating, the Taliban, at least the military wing, are helping terrorist groups like TTP, as well as the ETIM and the Uzbek IMUs and Ansarullah, the transnational terrorist groups that we see, to get basing in the border areas of Afghanistan. We saw that Taliban deployed suicide squads in the borders of Tajikistan. We saw the skirmishes with Iran just yesterday. And then we also see that the Pakistani army soldiers' killing rate has actually gone up since Taliban. And TTP is more active in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Northwestern Frontier, as it is called in WFP, than it was before. Therefore, we are in for a security disaster, and I'm afraid the worst case scenario could be a Syria type of model for Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thanks, Tamim. Quite a devastating analysis there, and a perfect segue into our next guest. It's Charlie Herbert, who's a retired British Army general who served 3 tours of Afghanistan and also spent some years in the Ministry of Defence in the UK working on Afghanistan issues. So he witnessed the flawed military assumptions that prevailed in the early days and the British military strategy between 2006 and 2014, when the international combat missions came to an end. Charlie, Tamim has given us his take on the ANDSS, the collapse before August 15, and the devastating security landscape that's prevailed and worsened since. And while there are success stories, of course, there was clearly an overall failure. So let's place the BRICS into context and take a look at why the US military pullout was, as you put it the other day, so utterly fatal so quickly. And you've also been very closely involved with Operation Pitting. And so if you could talk specifically about the post-August 15 evacuation effort, what went wrong and what went right, that'd be terrific. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. I'm sort of conscious that you wanted to use tonight to talk about the future, but this is a slightly reflective piece, as you and I discussed the other day. I mean, how on earth did we go from such a stunning victory in late 2001 to such an extraordinarily humbling defeat in 2021? And how did we betray our Afghan partners so completely? I mean, as always, Lynn, in the company of Afghans, I feel a certain amount of imposter syndrome when talking about this campaign. My engagements were fleeting, as you rightly say. I did 3 tours and I spent some time in the Ministry of Defence. But the war in Afghanistan, despite time elsewhere in Iraq and Sierra Leone and other places, the war defined 20 years of my professional military career, the last 20 years. I mean, my first engagement in Afghanistan came in the summer of 2002. I was a junior officer just out of Staff College, full of enthusiasm, posted to the Ministry of Defence. It was 8 months after the fall of the Taliban. We'd had this incredible success, and we were all talking about this was the future of warfare: special forces and air power, allied with indigenous forces, the Northern Alliance, used to overthrow an enemy. It was it was almost like a revolution in military affairs to a young officer who was struggling to understand the nature of warfare. And in that summer of 2002, I was dealing with 2 things. One was planning for the invasion of Iraq. That went well. And the other was working out what on earth we did with Afghanistan. And that summer, we had 100 British servicemen and women in Afghanistan. 100. You've got to ask yourself, how on earth did we go in 8 years from the rump of a deployment of 100 engineers to a deployment of 10,000 servicemen and women, most of whom in Helmand 8 years later. And I continually ask myself, and why did that fail so spectacularly to achieve the strategic outcomes that we thought it would achieve? I don't know. I guess, Lynn, and you referred to these sort of assumptions that we mentioned the other day. I think it came about through flawed decision-making based upon fundamentally flawed assumptions that nobody was prepared to challenge at the time, or more importantly, nobody was prepared to revisit afterwards, to question, okay, so we made some decisions upon those assumptions, but those assumptions have now proved false. What does that mean? None of us did that. We're all wise with hindsight, me particularly. So what were those assumptions? I think the first assumption is an assumption that we needed to expand beyond Kabul in 2002. Yeah, we all joke, but Hamid Karzai was the mayor of Kabul, and that we had to do more to expand his remit, to roll out provincial reconstruction teams clockwise, anti-clockwise around the country, to the north, to Mazar-e Sharif, to the west, to the south, to Kandahar and Helmand, and then into the east, and place within every single province a civil military contingent to do reconstruction. I mean, what a bizarre, extraordinarily arrogant assumption to make at that time. I think the second assumption what we made is that, I mean, this is just extraordinary, but a deployment to Helmand would only require a battalion, somewhere between 600 and 1,000 people, to provide the security for a civilian contingent to deliver development. Deeply flawed assumption. The third assumption is that by the summer of about 2004, 2005, we'd only have a very small contingent in Iraq, which would allow us to invest appropriate military manpower in Afghanistan, which of course, as we all know, is the greatest strategic blunder that we made. And we, the Brits and the Americans, find ourselves fighting a double medium campaign in 2 theatres of war that doesn't allow you to choose a main effort. Fundamentally flawed assumption. And then I think the one that I kind of agonize over the most, and I think maybe your audience will take issue with me, was an assumption that counterinsurgency as a doctrine, as a strategy, as a philosophy, as we like to think of it, works. And I'm not actually convinced that it does, based on the evidence of the last 20 years. So we had a succession of sort of flawed assumptions that led us to where we are. That's the context, that's the background. So my first real deployment, Lynn, to Afghanistan was in the summer of 2007. I played around in the margins. I'd been on a few visits. In summer of 2007, I was in Kandahar. By then, we had the best part of a brigade, maybe about 4,500, 5,000 soldiers in Helmand. It was the 3rd British brigade in 12 months. That should tell you something. We sent a parachute brigade, then we sent a commando brigade, then we sent an armoured brigade to Helmand. I mean, it was a succession of 6-month campaigns. This wasn't a prolonged campaign over a 10 to 20 year campaign. This was a succession of 6-month warfighting campaigns. which is an extraordinary way to approach any kind of long-term campaign. I mean, the other thing I don't think we understood was that we, the British, were fighting this as part of a coalition, a US-led coalition. And we semi-jokingly referred to Helmand as Helmandshire. It was a little part of Britain. It was like Surrey. And we would align it, we would have this wonderful analogy. It's about the size of Wales. It has about the population of this. We fundamentally failed to understand, but what we were trying to do was bring security and stability to a country, not just a province. And that was a great flaw. And it took us, I think, about 4 or 5 years. That's 2010 before we kind of started to address that. I then left Afghanistan. I went back in 2010. By then, we had about 10,000 soldiers in Helmand, a province that arguably was never particularly strategically significant, but had the greatest proportion of coalition troops in by 2010. It got worse. I was commanding the Brigade Advisor Group. I advised an Afghan Army brigade and an Afghan Army brigadier. I had servicemen and women embedded in Afghan Army battalions and Afghan Army companies across the whole of Helmand. We trained, we advised, we assisted, we accompanied them on operations. I thought it was kind of the right thing to do. I still think it was. We provided planning support, we provided air support, we provided casualty evacuation. And during that tour, I went up to Sangin quite early on. Everybody knows of Sangin, the heart of darkness, where the majority of British casualties took place in a small narco town of zero strategic interest in a big campaign. Up there, we had an Afghan Army battalion of 400 people, 400 men, and a British Royal Marine Commando battle group of 1,200 men and women. And it took me about 10 minutes in Sangin to work out that we'd kind of got the balance wrong. We were trying to make this our war rather than trying to support them in their war. And I genuinely believe that this is one of the great philosophical failures of everything that we did in this campaign. And then as we kind of handed over responsibility from 2010 to 2014, what did we do? We lifted off our advisors with the Afghan army and we kept our combat forces there, perpetuating the view that this was our war. And one sees some brilliant books, Jack Fairweather's The Good War, and you see it. I mean, there was this bizarre conceptual idea that this was our war rather than us supporting the Afghans in their war. And I'm happy to kind of come back to this one. And then we transitioned and we handed over security to the Afghans, and we ended combat operations at the end of 2014. And we often forget what happened, Lynn, and I think this is really important when we come to 2021. What happened is we saw the near collapse of the Afghan security forces at the end of 2014. We saw the near fall of Lashkar in 2015 and 2016. We saw the near fall of Kunduz and many other provincial capitals. It didn't happen, but gosh, we came to a hair's breadth of it. It was indicator. It was an indicator, it was a warning and a clear indicator of the fragility of the Afghan security forces after 15 years of development. After 15 years, they were still fragile. So we should have been able to predict what might happen 4 or 5 years later in the summer of 2021, when we lifted off the last traces of support to the Afghan security forces. Yeah, and absolutely everything that Tamim just said, I completely agree with. Now, I genuinely don't think anybody could have predicted the scale and the speed of the collapse this summer. I was there in 2017-18, embedded in the Afghan Ministry of Interior, responsible for helping to develop the Afghan police, the Afghan special police units like 222, many of you will be familiar with, did the crisis response in Kabul, 333 high-risk arrest operations, 444 in Kandahar, Afghan National Army Special Operations Command. These were very, very, very capable Afghan security forces. They were on a par with anything I've seen in the West. They should not have collapsed in the summer of 2020. Now Biden's withdrawal this summer, and you know, you might challenge me on this. I think it had 2 impacts. One was tactical. Tactically, it reduced the level of air support, the level of planning support, and the level of logistics support. the numbers of mechanics servicing Afghan helicopters and aircraft and all of that. That was damaging, but it wasn't fatal. It may have resulted in the loss of a provincial capital and some district capitals, but it shouldn't have been fatal. What of course happened psychologically, that withdrawal announcement had a much greater impact. And as we all saw, it saw a complete reduction in the will of the Afghan security forces to fight. Now, I'm not sure which collapsed first, the political side or the military side. And maybe we can kind of have a kind of discussion about that in the sidebar. I mean, I went on record this summer. At no point did I think Kandahar would fall this summer. It was inconceivable. It was inconceivable that Herat would fall this summer. It was inconceivable that the Mazar-e-Sharif would fall. It was completely off the radar that Kabul would fall this summer, but it did. And this is the discussion. What precipitated such a catastrophic collapse? I don't know. I'm in Mogadishu tonight, Lynn, and I ask myself this because it has relevance for everything we're doing globally in these kind of environments. Now, okay, I mean, you asked me to say a few words, Lynn, about pitting. I'll just do this very quickly. I wasn't involved in the evacuation. I was a critical observer. I've long been supporting Afghan interpreters who I worked with over many years. And I've long been beating the British governments up, the Secretary of State for Defence and CDS, to try and do the right thing and relocate interpreters who've been threatened for many years. It irritates me, if I'm being honest, but we've tried to sell this evacuation Operation Pitting, as we called it, as a kind of as a success, some kind of sort of, I don't know, symbolic Dunkirk moment. I mean, Dunkirk was a well-executed evacuation, but ultimately it was a strategic failure, as was Operation Pitting, and we shouldn't dress that up in any other way. I don't know who came out on that evacuation. I do not know who was lifted out. As I said to the Chief of Defence Staff one night in a very heated phone call, I don't care if you lift 10,000 people out or 100,000 people out. The only metric that matters is how many very vulnerable people you leave behind. And my sense is that we've left the most vulnerable behind in Afghanistan, and we brought out the wrong people. And now I'm happy to explore that, but that's my, and the fact that this government won't actually tell us who came out just kind of slightly worries me. But I've spent the last 3 months trying to get some of those vulnerable people out. Interpreters, Afghan special forces, NDS officers who were partnered with our intelligence agencies, but you might have seen on BBC Newsnight, and various other people who challenged the Taliban either on the battlefield or challenged the Taliban ideologically, and whose lives are at threat. And many of those we still haven't got out. And that is a great stain on us as a nation. It really is. And it worries me that the impetus and the media interest and the Home Office interest in it is on the wane at the moment. I'll leave it there. I've spoken for too long. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. Very erudite. I can tell you that sitting in Herat and watching Herat fall in early August, it was pretty clear to me that Kabul was going to be not far behind, and certainly the only surprise was that it was on the day it was and not a week later, to be honest with you. And I think by the time that happened, there was a lot of surprise had been dissipated, but another PhD, I'm sure. The next person on our panel that we're going to talk to is Wally Rasmani. He's been a good friend of mine for many years. He's a media entrepreneur who set up Afghanistan's first digital platform, Carbonara, and followed it up with a daily subscription service that was initially called Reporterly App and is now called Brevity. And I can tell you, I think it's a terrific product and essential reading on a daily basis if you want to keep up with important developments in Afghanistan even now. Wally, thanks for joining us. You're in Sweden after a harrowing escape of your own from the Taliban, and you've been watching the light of journalism fade and go out in Afghanistan. And I'd like to ask you, what do you think has been the Taliban's immediate impact on media generally and journalism specifically, and what do you think of the long-term consequences? Over to you, Wally.
Yeah, Lynn, thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Wally, it's a really bad connection. Do you think that you could disconnect and then maybe reconnect?
I think I'm not mute.
Maybe while we sort out Wally's sound problems, we can throw to Chris.
Lynn, can you hear me?
No, it's not a good line, Wally. Let's throw first to you, Chris. Chris Alexander,
sure.
And we'll come back to Wally when we get his sound quality sorted out. So, Chris, we had you on our last Afghanistan 20 Years On forum, and you're back by popular demand, believe it or not. Chris is a former ambassador for Canada to Afghanistan, to the Republic, and a former Canadian Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. And he's been extremely vocal in recent months about Pakistan's role in the war in Afghanistan and in the collapse of the Republic. And Chris, this evening, instead of revisiting that, maybe we could tread on ground about what's going on now. We were talking the other day about Pakistan's on-the-ground encouragement of jihadi groups, what its aim is, and I'm wondering if you could speak to what Pakistan is doing in that general regionalized and globalized jihadi space, and who's it doing it with, and why does it seem to be getting away with it? Chris.
Thanks, Lynn. Great to be with you all. I think today we have to admit that what is happening is that the ISI, having had this strategic success in Afghanistan as they see it, are trying to create a new ecosystem of proxies based inside Afghanistan, supported from Pakistan, with a view to pursuing three objectives. One is to create a dynamic that will increase strengthen prospects for recognition of the Taliban as a government, either by stages or, in the case of some countries, in one step. They want the Taliban to be perceived as the relatively moderate players, the safe set of hands that need to be relied upon to put more radical elements like ISK and some of these other emerging groups into their places. Secondly, they want to have a platform in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, for Central Asia, for Southwest Asia, for the region, that features new groups, some of them nationally focused, as in the case of Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement or the IMU, some with specialized tactics, some with liaison relationships that are strong to the Kashmiri groups, for example, in the case of ISK. They want to scale these groups up to be able to influence and operate, if necessary, in a wider region, as they did in the late 1990s. And then thirdly, no one should, I think, be under any illusions about the determination of these ISI bosses and their masters in GHQ to continue the project of global jihad with Al-Qaeda and ISK as principal players, but potentially with new players as well, partnering with groups in elsewhere in Southwest Asia or in Africa, or indeed in any country around the world, East Asia, for example, as well. And I think this will need very serious tracking. Why have they gotten away with it? Well, I think what we've seen for 20 years and longer has been a strategic failure to keep up with the planning and operations of the ISI, to see them for what they are. There isn't the same level of media scrutiny. In Pakistan, it's very hard for Pakistani journalists or international journalists to delve into these issues, as you and so many others know firsthand, Lynn. There hasn't been diplomatic scrutiny. It's just not done. Most missions in Islamabad have some level of cooperation with ISI. They're focused on that. It's hard for them to see over the fence into Directorate S and the other branches of the Pakistani intelligence community where this activity is happening. And then thirdly, I think we have to acknowledge deep strategic failure on the part of all of Afghanistan's partners to profile the threat properly. When I was in the country, I remember working with US forces, several allies, to start profiling the order of battle of the Taliban, the Haqqani group, and others across the border in Pakistan. But the analysis never got beyond that into the actual structures of Directorate S. There was some expertise in Afghan services, I would say a few individuals in our services across NATO allies, but not nearly enough. And look at, by their own admission, the CIA record of trying to penetrate these groups and trying to penetrate the Pakistani intelligence agencies that are running these operations. They admit that they've lost most of the significant assets that they had. It's a bit like the admissions they've made with regard to trying to penetrate Chinese intelligence. They've had their networks blown over and over again. So where do we start? I think we start by admitting our failures, by seeing this as a threat that hasn't gone away, by refusing to be in denial, and by choosing a new strategy. And I agree with Omar Sada that this didn't begin 20 years ago. This didn't begin with the creation of Pakistan. This is a legacy, as I've written about at great length, that goes way back into the 19th century and even beyond, but certainly begins with the British Northwest frontier policy, one of interference and deliberate activities across different shifting lines of influence and proxy influence into Afghanistan. That is a very old habit. And my argument, and I think the consensus among those who are tracking these issues seriously, is that Pakistan is the current holder of, title holder for that policy, if you will. And we've simply, because Pakistan is a bigger country, tried to be good friends with Pakistan, tried to bring Pakistan on board by bonhomie and negotiation and pious hopes against hope. Well, it hasn't worked out. And this has cost both the Pakistani people and especially the Afghan people enormously. I think we need to start again, see this as the proxy war that it always has been, deal with it in some of the ways we started to deal with Iran's proxy activity across several countries, and certainly the way we've started to deal with and confront Vladimir Putin's invasions, which were, by his account, through proxies, as we know now, actually using regular armed forces that were reflagged, rebadged to look like proxies. But this is the same kind of warfare. It's hybrid warfare that includes highly trained forces, regular and irregular, and is combined with information warfare, influence, lobbying, and so forth. We're just behind the curve in dealing with Pakistan's brand of hybrid warfare, in my view.
Thanks, Chris. Wally Rasmani, I don't think is going to be able to rejoin us. He's got terrible connectivity problems in Sweden. So I'm just going to ask a question, and maybe you can throw yourselves in on it. I mean, there's an awful lot of coulda, shoulda, woulda about the hubris of the 20 years, the lies that basically enabled it to continue on towards failure as it did. And the Taliban may still be interim, but they're here. And the question is, and a lot of people like to say, it won't be long, they give them 6 months and law will collapse. But as you've just said, Chris, they've got the backing of the Pakistanis. As you said, Tamim, it's there is anarchy. There's no dealing with anarchy. Where does it all go? And there's their own insurgency they're dealing with on the fringes. So are we stuck with them? For how long? And what comes next? Who wants to take that on? Raise a hand or just jump on in. Tamim, why don't you give it a go?
Right. In my lifetime, I've seen 4 regimes fall apart in front of my eyes. Normally, every takeover in Afghanistan, if it is not combined with social justice, service delivery, and security, it will fall. And normally, if you recall 2002, after every collapse and takeover, there is this shock period, which normally lasts between 6 months to 1 year, of the population weighing the new regime, the new rulers. That's why in 2003, you didn't see much insurgency across Afghanistan. It was, everybody thought, just like now Taliban, that everything is rosy, we are now the rulers and there's no resistance. And then when the night raids and others started and this revenge killings, people started, forming pockets of resistance. Now, in case of the Taliban right now, they're doing it at a faster pace right now. There's already pockets of resistance being created across Afghanistan, and they're within their 5th month now. And the humanitarian catastrophe will beef up their opposition, and they're very well aware of that. And it's also beefing up the ranks and file of Daesh, ISKP in Afghanistan, sadly. In fact, ISKP is now probably the biggest alternative to the Taliban, besides the resistance, because they have the capabilities to fight, as well as the attacks that they do. So if Taliban continue their brutalities, extrajudicial killing, the arbitrary arrests, next summer, when the winter is gone, they would have a full-fledged civil war at their hand. And if they continue their confrontations with Afghanistan's neighbors, you saw the episode with Iran, even with Pakistanis, the TTP, with their own, with Central Asians, we see that the unhappy friends of the Taliban, the region, who were, using this Frankenstein against the Americans and Western, backers of the former government, the Frankenstein will come back and eat them. And it is sadly what is happening. That the Frankenstein they nurtured, now they don't know what they have to do with it. Now, some of the Pakistanis you talk to, they say, yes, they are there, but we are doomed with them if they change. We're also doomed with them if they don't change. Because sadly, it will have spillover effects. It's already having spillover effects, and it's inspiring many jihadists to replicate Taliban success. And you saw all sorts of congratulatory messages coming from across the world, to the Taliban, and from all the usual suspects, the Al-Qaeda's, the others, congratulating Taliban on their victory and hoping that they would secure something like that in their own areas. So therefore, I think their sustainability would depend on whether they would be able to transform from that militia proxy to a government, responsible government, and that therefore far away from that.
Thanks, Tamim. You could also say that the Taliban's victory is not only emboldened jihadist groups elsewhere, but regimes like China's, perhaps vis-a-vis Taiwan. But that's for another panel discussion, I think. Charlie, you just raised your hand. I was going to come to you anyway because, you know, Tamim is talking about the possibility of a full-blown civil war by summer next year. Lessons learned, does anybody have the appetite to come in to help? Or are we going to stand on the sidelines and just watch this time because we're still licking our wounds from 2021? What do you think?
I mean, history suggests we'll stand and watch. This is no longer our fight. I hope I'm proved wrong in terms of a humanitarian response, but I worry that I might not be. The question the reason I put my hand up is we often focus on the external threats to the Taliban. You know, the competing interests, whether that's Jamiat, the Panjshiris, Uzbeks, whether that is externals. But the question that I was going to ask of Tamim and Omar, if I may, is about the internal threats to the Taliban, because I'm hearing a lot about this. And we've often said it's not a single homogenous mass. And it cannot relent on girls' education. It cannot become more moderate because of the internal pressures that it's facing from those who have been fighting jihad for 20 years. Haqqani in particular. I suppose the question here is what is the possibility that the Taliban will tear itself apart internally? And what does that mean? Does that mean that they splinter and they strengthen Islamic State Khorasan, or what does it mean?
May I? If I just jump in here. About the nature of Taliban, I think it's much more complicated than what we assume, in the sense that both in terms of ideational components of the Taliban, but also in terms of that material components of it. Number one, in terms of, for example, in terms of ideational components, they come from this very conservative interpretation of Islam generated since 1980s in the madrasas of Haqqani network madrasas in Pakistan and the other side of the border. Now, this was also amalgamated with a layer of very tribal kind of customary laws, traditions, and values, which has been also influenced over time with the warfare and jihadism in the south of Afghanistan. Then on top of these two, you have very exclusionary ethno-nationalism of Afghan, which many deny for the case of Taliban, that they are not, but of course, many of their policies, stances, and rhetorics continuously reinforce that Afghanhood, what in Farsi is called Afghaniyat wa Islamiyat. So both of these are reflected there in Taliban. In terms of material component, you have, of course, so we have so many times analysts talk about two branches, Haqqanis and the others, but more than that, beyond these Haqqanis and the Quetta Shura, you have a component of Taliban who are still functioning like warlords. And these are somehow, for example, operating like a militias and a kind of outlying regions where they do not obey necessarily, in most of the cases, to the orders of the top. So that's why you see extrajudicial killings. You can see tortures. You can see some of these commanders only just outlining their own rules and trying to implement those. The second component, I think you can also see certain commanders who are like gang leaders and the townships, like the one who have been recently joining the Taliban rank and file, right? Particularly the intelligence chief of the Taliban in Panjshir. So he was a gang in his previous portfolio also, and now he joined the Taliban as a new member. So you can see that one also. Then there is also a transnational network of extended family relationship between, which defines in certain kind of level, in certain level, the Taliban characteristics. And finally, a bit of tribalism. Now, whether they can sustain or they can last, or whether they will be fragmented, I think analysts so far has failed to predict this, because time and again, there were predictions that they will fragment themselves. Of course, they do not function as a very hierarchical, organized, bureaucratic group. They are organized as a network of networks, right? So much decentralized, but now they have to transform to function as a state. But now I think reflecting on experience of other jihadists or mainstream Islamists and Middle East, for example, how Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt tried to negotiate back and forth with liberals on one hand and Salafis on the other hand, because Salafis were trying to continuously push society towards much more radical. And then in between, Muslim Brotherhood wanted to reconcile these two, but at the same time, they couldn't appease liberals. And instead, they tried to align at the beginning in 2012 and 13, when the elections were coming, try to appease Salafis in order to look at them as a potential allies compared to liberals. Now, the Taliban will also do the same thing. They have to appease certain very radical extremists in order to prevent emergence of ISKP. And then at the same time, they will also come up with certain kind of rhetoric to international community. Well, see guys, if you do not recognize us, the alternative will not be liberals, but very much radical groups like ISKP. So I think they will not fragment as we imagine. They will continue to function in a very autonomous manner, accommodating all these different strands, whether they are Southern Pashtuns or the Eastern ones or radical or moderate ones. But at the same time, there is no much departure from the very core principles, ideological principles, which defines Deobandi Islam. They are moderate now in the cities. For example, they do not ban music, right? They have not, for example, touched people based on their appearance or clothes or length of beard, only in Kabul. Now, these are very calculated, politicized political decisions, not driven just by ideology, but in the sense that they can understand how to rule, for example, urban centers vis-a-vis the rural. But in rural areas, you see that how people are beaten just for listening music, or probably disobeying certain very ridiculous rules of the Taliban. So they have remained quite, very flexible in the sense that how to manage different Afghanistan in the city and Afghanistan in rural areas, but also in terms of messaging to international community. Now, this does not mean that they will last in power, as other philo Islamists in Middle East couldn't do it, right? Be it very, very moderate ones which were reconciling with liberal democracy, like the Nahda in Tunisia, led by Ghanouchi, or the ones in Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, where they tried to reconcile two different streams, the Salafis on one hand and liberals on the other hand. But the very fact is that this is failure of political Islam. They are not prepared to govern. And Taliban also have clearly shown us that they are not prepared to govern. We need to ask this question: what is the political agenda of Islamists beyond just Islamizing society continuously, right? So you can, of course, Taliban, they in last 20 years, they ruled certain areas, but ruling as an insurgent and a small insurgency is quite different compared to that of ruling a country which is diverse, over 13 million people, which has been transformed fundamentally with the project of last 20 years democratization and state building. So to make it simple, one, I don't think Taliban will be able to govern. Second, they will not be able to rule for a long period of time. Now, it's quite difficult to predict how long does it take. 1 year, 5 years, 6 years like the previous, or much more. This is all because of several factors. One, we don't have a very potential strong resistance at the moment. Second, very reluctant international community, either to recognize Taliban also, but also condemn them. So this will provide a space for Taliban, but at the end of the day, as they cannot represent the entire complex social fabric of Afghanistan, probably roughly, if you say 30% of the people of Afghanistan ethnically, culturally, and ideologically will support Taliban. The rest may not. And this will make it tough for them because they cannot establish that social cohesion which is needed in terms of relationship between the state on top and society at the other level. That in order to establish order, it is not just bureaucratic capacity, but also it's in terms of ideas of state, but also the cohesion that you need to have. Now, in terms of ideas, Islamic Emirate, that's not so much fascinating for many in Afghanistan. And of course, it's undefined and slowly it's evolving, and people will touch it. Okay, what sort of state these guys are trying to create for us? And we should remember, in the last 20 years, people of Afghanistan have come to know what does it mean to have human rights? What does it mean to have a democratic governance? What does it mean to have services and expectation from the state to do certain things? So now these Taliban leaders are coming and saying, well, we have won this war with the help of God, but now you people can go and ask God to feed you. We are not here to feed you. So this is something that, of course, people will not endorse it, be it today or tomorrow, and Taliban will fail. Unfortunately, our Western allies do not appreciate this fact. And I mean, time and again, it was repeated that, well, Taliban represent indigenous communities of Afghanistan, and they are, I don't know, indigenous, very grassroots movement. Of course, they have that social capital. That social capital is Haqqani madrasas in Pakistan, plus tribal norms and cultures in south of Afghanistan. However, that's not Afghanistan, all of it, right? It's just a segment of Afghanistan, and the rest of Afghanistan will try to resist, maybe passively, like very courageous women of Afghanistan now in cities like Herat and Kabul, that they still stand against these guys, or maybe actively, the way resistance is evolving. So if we want to come up with a political settlement, this is not the way to go forward. To just pressurize Taliban, an exchange of humanitarian aid or any other sort of leverage that the international community has to accept it. Rather, we need to go beyond the simplistic way and find out how can we build a political settlement, which includes everyone. And I will stop here.
Thanks a lot, Emma. Very comprehensive. We've got a couple of minutes left, so we can take some questions from people who've tuned in. Sandra Kaduri asks, which international actors are currently having the most leverage in holding Taliban to account and stopping human rights violations? Chris, maybe you can speak to that.
I don't think anyone is having much leverage at the moment. The hope of most of the partners who thought they had leverage was that even with the quick victory, the rapid victory of August, there would be a more inclusive government, that the moderates, the Quetta Shura, Abdul Ghani Baradar and others would have more influence, would be central. And that has simply not been the case. I mean, we saw the DGISI visit Kabul to impose his Haqqani, right and left-hand men as the central players in this regime. They're tough. They see leverage coming from a long way away, and they're doing their best to avoid being subject to it. That said, there are forms of leverage over Pakistan in its attempt to bring legitimacy to the Taliban that are effective and can be more effective. One is the Financial Action Task Force. Another is the whole issue of credentials for the UN, for the Afghan delegation at the UN, and the way we treat the government in exile, which isn't functioning at the moment, but still exists in pockets around the world. On the model of 1996 to 2001, and then there's the humanitarian message, which has come through loudly and clearly with the visit of all the top UN humanitarians to Kabul. I don't think they've been brilliant in the way they've delivered these messages. They've tended to be men huddled with Taliban men, talking about feeding people, not humiliating the Taliban in the eyes of their own people in the world in diplomatic ways, as I think we should be doing every day. But it's better to have had them there and to have them engaged and this $4.5 billion appeal underway than to have nothing. The leverage that we could have, though, would come from doing the normal things that we would do in this situation. I mean, we all understand that China is obsessed with Taiwan, and there's a big international effort underway to prevent China from invading Taiwan. Whether it's effective or not, we'll see. Russia and Ukraine, we know the story as well. Another crescendo this week, but very serious sanctions, very serious political effort by NATO. We'll see if it works, but it's happening. We know that Iran is obsessed with Israel and obsessed with influence in its region, fighting proxy wars for decades. I wouldn't say there's great coherence to the response, but there is a response, a strong one. Pakistan has been obsessed with Afghanistan since it lost East Pakistan in 1971. I think this is what people who claim to be students of the conflict fail to recognize. This cohort of generals who came out of that failure, which was a conventional failure in battle to the Indian army, switched horses to irregular warfare, and they have been fighting it in Afghanistan ever since, scaling up dramatically in recent times. But they have gotten this far because they've gotten away with it. We haven't used the sanctions, used the UN Charter, used all the political tools at our disposal that we would normally use. And why haven't we? Because we thought Pakistan was important for engaging with China. We thought Pakistan was important in the 1980s for fighting jihad against the Soviets. We thought Pakistan was important after 9/11 as a partner in the war on terror. And then after 2010, we thought Pakistan was a crucial partner for bringing about a settlement with the Taliban. Well, all of that has failed. And ignoring Afghanistan also failed in the 1990s. It's time to try something else. And I think what we need to do is try the traditional forms of leverage with the Taliban's bosses, masters, bankers in Islamabad and Rawalpindi. It's sanctions, it's coercive diplomacy. Until we try it, we're not going to get anywhere.
Thank you, Chris. I've got a question here from Chris Pocock, who is a defence journalist in London. His question, he says, is for Tamim, but I think, Charlie, you might also want to have a stab at it. Is the US military's notion that it can do over-the-horizon surveillance and targeting of IS, etc., in Afghanistan a fantasy? Who's going to go first? Tamim, you go first, and then Charlie, you can weigh in if you like.
Sure. Now, I've been vocal about this particular thing. You need three things for the over-the-horizon to work relatively effectively. The first one is a partner on the ground on intelligence matters to give you the right targets, all the human intelligence aspect of it. Secondly, you need bases which are nearby, which is sustainable from a logistics point of view, and how much assets you can keep on air. And thirdly, is of course whether it will degrade the capabilities that you would like to degrade. Now, the two experiences from history tells me it has never been successful in Afghanistan. The first one is the Tomahawk cruise missiles episode of Bill Clinton, when the attacks happened at U.S. embassies, and then the response of Clinton administration was to fire cruise missiles in Jalalabad and in Khost, targeting Al-Qaeda camps. 5 years later, 3 years later, actually, 3 to 4 years later, 9/11 happened. It did not degrade anything because of the geography of that country, because it really didn't matter for Al-Qaeda to be able. That's why the geography of Afghanistan is such a difficult geography that I don't think, no matter how many drones or F-16s or Tomahawk cruise you send, it doesn't really does the job. The second episode is, of course, the recent one of the airport incident where an ISKP target was attacked, and the New York Times did a terrific investigative story on it, where they actually killed a humanitarian aid worker's family on faulty intelligence. Now I know, and I'm hearing a lot of reports from inside of Afghanistan that there are a lot of drones flying over Kandahar, Kabul, those areas. That's why Sirajuddin Haqqani and a few others are not coming out, because they think there's a still threat against them coming from the skies. I must say one of the other prerequisites is, of course, the flight permissions. You need to use the airspace of Pakistan and Iran. I don't know, and other countries. Right now it's Pakistan, and that would create dependencies every time. How much you want to trust the Pakistanis, or I don't know, the Russians or the Iranians, whatever the over the flight permission you would give, that they would not give heads up to the Taliban on certain things. That is there because of, again, dependencies and the intelligence relationship that is there. I don't think it will work. What it will do is that it will probably keep them on their feet, but it will also alert them. But they are such dynamic force that they would be able to evade it and create other alternative mechanisms to be able to evade it. And I've got a good friend who has a lot of experience in this thing, and he often tells me, if you couldn't do it with 100,000 troops on the ground, how can you do it with a few drones or F-16s or other armed ISRs? If they and you heard the Deputy Secretary of Defense of the United States on the record publicly saying that ISKP and other terrorist groups, including Al Qaeda, would get the capability to attack US and allies within 6 months to a year. That is US Deputy Secretary of Defense telling the Congress of the United States of America that within 6 months to a year they would have capabilities to plan and attack US and allies. So I don't think it will work, but it will maybe put them on alert, or at least keep them on the foot.
Charlie, do you want to put your 2 cents worth in on this issue? And then I think that's all that we'll have time for, but it would be good to hear your views.
I mean, just very briefly, Lynn, I mean, I very much agree with what Tammy said. My heart says it's delusional. It's complete fantasy to think that one can defeat CT threats through an over-the-horizon capability. I mean, arguably, if that was possible, there was no need to go into Afghanistan in 2001 to remove Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and no need to go into Syria to remove Islamic State. So my heart tells me that. My head, though, Lynn, tells me that it might just be enough to reduce the threats to an acceptable level in 2021. And it might actually, to policymakers and politicians, be a preferable strategy than putting boots on the ground again. So I don't buy into it, but I can see that it's going to be attractive, Lynn.
Okay, well, let's see where it all goes. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My guests, Shahzad Akbar, Omar Sada, Tommy Massey, Charlie Herbert and Chris Alexander, thank you so much for your time, and to everybody who tuned in. We may as well finish here with a Merry Christmas, and we'll see you in 2022.